When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing clinical social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 24, The Beauty of Movement Unleashed Her True Potential. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our lovely and daring guest, Dr. Shemine Gulamhusein, PhD in Child and Youth Care, believes in the power of movement and how each muscle within the body tells its own story. During the day, Dr. Shemine is an assistant professor in the Department of Child and Youth Care at MacEwan University, focusing on global perspectives, mental health, and family care. Dr. Shemine's research focuses on the intersection of recreation, development, race, culture, spirituality, and pre- and post-migration trauma. By night, if Dr. Shemine is not spending time with clients in her private practice at Engaged Care, she allows her muscle twitches to guide her art creations, drive her physical activity, and enter and embrace unknown spaces. In her free time, she enjoys a round of golf and weaving at home. Hey, Dr. Shemine, welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Oh my goodness, Dr. Shemine, I can't begin to tell you how fortunate I feel to be with you on this episode. I appreciate your willingness and your support for taking a stance to help break barriers of mental stigma.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. So, Dr. Shemine, I'm aware that you follow the show quite closely. And so I know that you know that this podcast is all about bringing forward untold stories. And you and I both know that whether a person has a story that's directly about mental health or not, there is one element at least that is mental health related that doesn't get spoken about, and that there is impact on someone's mental health, and that remains tucked away. So this platform is meant to give space to, a close and personal mission of mine to help break barriers of mental stigma, which we can see has been conditioned in our society. So I'm hoping that our conversation today is really giving an opportunity to encourage other people to share and tell what people sometimes have reservations for voicing. So I'm working on this trend called the mental beauty rethink. Dr. Shemine, what comes to mind when you hear about this trend, mental beauty?
What I like about it is that it offers a strength-based approach. It speaks to how the ebb and flow of our mental health.
Mm-hmm.
It speaks to how that ebb and flow has a beauty that under roots it, and it just brings a sense of joy to the journey.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a sense of joy to the journey. I like the way that you've articulated that. That's actually quite very much the mission of those words. Amazing. Okay. So, Dr. Shemine, are you ready to get started?
Absolutely.
Okay. So our first question, Give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story.
I think my title would be Navigating Developmental Obstacles Through Sport.
Okay. Can you share a little bit more about this interesting title, Navigating Developmental Obstacles Through Sport?
Mhm. I think it comes back down to this idea that as young children and as we age and we grow, we're expected to meet certain developmental milestones, and these developmental milestones are often pre-allocated, and many people, I think, don't meet them as always expected, especially from a medical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the idea is that through finding joy or passion, and for me that was sport, it allowed me to overcome some of what was determined or defined as an obstacle in my developmental journey. And I think what became really beautiful in that was that sport allowed me to reach developmental expectations in a
Mm-hmm.
way that was unspoken, in a way that was uh, embodied within myself. It was powerful and meaningful to me as a person. And so when I met those developmental milestones, it wasn't just for the meeting expectations of others, but it was truly meeting expectations of myself. And it truly allowed me to feel as though I was performing at the best of my abilities.
Wow. That is such an interesting way to talk about navigating developmental obstacles and challenges. So I'm curious, can you give us a little bit of a snapshot in terms of the elements of your untold story that we're about to get into today?
Yeah, I think the untold story comes from this idea that I grew up in a very comfortable, a very welcoming, a very supportive household, and yet I still struggle to approach or maybe not approach. I still struggle to meet expectations of reading and writing literacy, of being academically on par with my peers, and it was quite a journey because I spent many hours with tutors and educators supporting me and helping me and really trying to encourage me to meet certain milestones. And then it was
Mm-hmm.
when my parents and I had decided that I would play a sport, and that sport ended up being ringette.
Mm-hmm.
And when I ended up playing that sport, I quickly fell into line with some of the academic milestones that was previously not meeting. And part of that, I think, is rooted in that, what I was saying earlier, but a degree of self-confidence, a degree of self-worth,
Mm-hmm.
a degree of understanding what my body was trying to do in the classroom, which was a little bit opposite or
Mm-hmm.
contradictory to what was expected of my body as a young female. And so I think that, yeah, I think that there was a bit of a journey where academics and physical movement came together and blended together to allow development to occur in a way that, again, that was meaningful.
Mm-hmm. So when you say that there was, certain expectations that were definitely present, what did you feel some of those expectations were at this young age?
I think one of the biggest expectations that I still remember and embody till this day is that being a young girl, I was expected to sit at my desk quietly, respectfully, to,
Mm-hmm.
read and write at a particular level, to listen to every word that was being told to me by my educator, and to believe every word that was being shared with me. I think other expectations of staying clean when I was outside on the park, or
Mm-hmm.
coming home at what would be seen as a reasonable time, and directly from class versus stopping at the playground was an expectation. And thankfully,
Mm-hmm.
my parents didn't always expect that. And as they started to understand myself, they started to realize that those expectations needed to shift a little bit, and that stopping at the park on the way home was actually a healthy response for me, or a healthy transition for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sharing with us about those expectations as a young girl and the picture that was painted for you, you sort of had the impression of, and that you were trying to navigate. What were some of the things that you struggled with while trying to understand yourself? What were some of the struggles that came up?
Yeah, I struggled with with a few things. I struggled with, as I think I've alluded to, some of the reading and writing skills. I wasn't able to read efficiently until quite late, probably grade 6, grade 7.
Mm-hmm.
I struggled with some of the gender expectations placed on me. So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
I preferred wearing pants and sweaters and that stuff versus dresses and skirts and so forth. I
Mm-hmm.
Another one that often comes to mind for me, a struggle, was just belonging, feeling a sense of belonging within community. I
Mm.
I think I engaged with activity on a more physical level, so I preferred to do things like camping and learning how to make a fire from scratch and those kind of things versus desk-based crafts, which often happened in the Girl Guides group that I was with. So I think those were struggles that
Right.
impacted not only my developmental milestones, but I think it impacted my sense of confidence and my sense of belonging within communities. And when I think about sport and that navigation, I think that it was through sport that I learned to navigate those uncomfortable or unknown spaces.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. So, talking about these expectations and struggles and the examples that you've highlighted, and even things such as the academics, the reading and the writing, and you said it wasn't until grade 6 or 7 where you were able to really pick up on these skills. Was this the pattern until grade 6 or 7, or was there something different that happened in your younger years?
When I think about the pattern, no, I think the patterns are pretty distinct. Actually, I think I struggled
Mm-hmm.
until a point where I remember very vividly my brother and I sitting at our family dining room table, and I was asked to read a page of a book that was probably shy of where I should have been able to read, and I could not understand, or I could not figure out what the children in the story were having for breakfast. And I probably read that page about 4 or 5 times, and I still couldn't grasp what they were having for breakfast. The spelling and understanding of the word waffle didn't make sense to me. And I realized in that frustration, not only my own, but that of my brothers who I looked up to and continue to look up to, that there was something not quite on par, that something wasn't working, and I was no longer able to hide that I couldn't read or write.
Right.
Um, and it was at that point that I think something clicked.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually at the same time that I started playing sport too. So it was at the same time that I moved from playing in the backyard and
Mm.
in the community to actually playing an organized sport that was ringette. And I think that those two things happened simultaneously, which I'm not sure, but I believe kind of clicked in my brain. There was a connection that took place, and then with that came the sense of belonging into that sport community team, and that
Right.
what we would call our team as a family. And so things started to fall into line. So the pattern shifted to
Mm-hmm.
finding a space where I belonged and where I felt confident and I felt I understood what my body was doing. And I think that is what shifted the pattern for me, and I think that pattern has continued till this day.
So that was a really big marker for you when you sat with your brother and you were reading that page. And I'm hearing that simultaneous process of being introduced to sport was one aspect, which maybe sort of gave you the way or the answer to break free from the pattern. That's what I'm hearing. And it's interesting that you talk about, sitting with your brother and having that moment of, oh wow, okay, something's got to change, or I can't hide this anymore, or I've got to face this somehow.
Yeah, I think that there's an embarrassment to sit in front of the people that love you the most and support you the most,
Mm,
and actually now have to
mhm.
honor and acknowledge those developmental obstacles, right? It comes with the, again, that wanting to belong and wanting to be seen and wanting to be seen for your strengths. And I think that that's where that mental health beauty sits in, and I think that's the connection, is that
Mhm.
we all want to be seen for our strengths. And oftentimes the way we in the greater society language mental health is that it's a deficit based approach. And
Right.
I think that as soon as someone helps you switch it, that's the beauty in it. And I think that that's partially what this podcast is heading. or sorry, not heading to, but doing.
Yes, that is definitely the intention of the podcast. And we, for too long, have been focusing from that deficit framework. And that is the whole premise of, taking the mental beauty approach, right? So for me, it's all parts of health is important. All parts of health is for our greater wellness, and physical health should be no greater or less than mental health. But I find that when you hear the word mental health, people already get uncomfortable just hearing those two words, right? So definitely a deficit mind frame shows up. And I'm just really, I guess I'm really processing this experience that you had and how that showed up in in how you were seen, or how you saw yourself, or what you were desiring. I'm hearing you say about, like, you weren't, there was a time where you weren't able to read, and there was lack of interest and lack of desire. But I guess from what you've just shared, I'm learning about what was underneath all of that, right? There's this worry to disappoint your parents. And I'm kind of hearing you say a little bit about worried about disappointing your older brother, like your brother who's sitting with you and helping you read, or trying to read with you, and you having to come to terms of, like, I think I can't hide this. This is not something, as confusing as it is. I'm recognizing what the thing is that I'm really confused about is as well, right? So you can just see all these different pieces from underneath emerging.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit deeper. I would almost challenge myself to shift from, was it worry, or was it what we would language shame, right? That there's a shame around not being able to perform in a way, and I think that's where sports actually really allowed me to shine and build up my sense of worth and my sense of confidence, because
Mm-hmm.
it was
Mm-hmm.
on the ice, that first glide, even though I fell probably 10 seconds later, but I felt like I understood the way my body was moving, and I understood that the twitches that were happening in my body were positive, and they were actually rewarded in that space. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
in an academic space, the movement of a young body is considered disruptive often. And I think that that narrative is changing significantly in classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, it was busy bodies were not good students. And so all of a sudden, I had this outlet where I was able to move my body in what felt like a natural way, and in fact was rewarded for moving it in that way, which helped me build up some of that sense of worth. And I remember narratives from my parents they've shared where, that first time I off or stepped onto the ice, yeah, I fell a couple steps in, but I had the biggest smile on my face because all of a sudden I was comfortable, and I was comfortable in a space that I didn't even know. I didn't
Yeah.
even understand. I didn't I was
You
it was
felt
such
free, and you could be comfortably uncomfortable with space. There was space to navigate. There was space to
yeah.
try things out.
And there was encouragement to move my body in different ways, right? So I was told, push your leg this way,
Yes.
pull your arm out this way, do this. And all of a sudden, all of those movements that had been restricted in other spaces
Mm-hmm.
was now allowing me to achieve.
You had permission. Yes, the opportunity was there, permission,
Yeah, permission and achieve.
and you could see that something felt good for you, and it felt good for you, and you knew it was good for you. Did you feel like it was liberating?
Like, it's hard to say. I guess now reflecting back, there was some liberation, but for me, I think the liberation came from, one, the body movements making sense and being meaningful, but then
Yes.
two, and more importantly for long-term development, I think that idea of a sense of belonging and finding a group of people
Mm-hmm.
that understood the world in a similar way that I did, and allowed their bodies to move in a similar way that I did. And it's so multi-layered, right? All of this, but ultimately I think the liberation came from that sense of worth, sense of
Mm-hmm.
uh, belonging, and ultimately impacted my confidence, which I think has allowed me to understand mental health as beautiful, because without that opportunity, I think it would have been easy to fall into, well, I'm just not capable. And so why even try?
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. It's been quite a journey for you, and I'm curious a little bit about what sorts of somatic work that you have done. That's sort of been part of your journey here with the developmental challenges, navigating your way with movement.
Yeah, I think somatic work has been critical. It's been crucial. I think as I moved through some of my adult academics or my post secondary academics, what I really started to work on was understanding muscle twitches and understanding movements. And
Mm-hmm.
how I like to think about it is that each movement or each twitch, each part of our body has its own little brain, is what I like to say, and it tells me something different. So every time my
Mm-hmm.
feet go super cold, I know that I'm entering space that
Mm-hmm.
feels uncomfortable, but it's still safe enough
Mm-hmm.
that I can enter because it's
Mm-hmm.
my toes are cold, not a huge deal. But when I start to feel my hands sweating and I start to feel my fingers twitching, I know that there's something inside of me that I need to document or I need to write. And so I find myself moving towards my laptop to, allow those muscle twitches in my fingers to write or produce something in that moment. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. And I think one of the instigators for trying to do some of that work was, as a young person, I often heard, well, do you have butterflies in your stomach,
Mm-hmm.
when they thought I was nervous? And I never understood that because I never felt butterflies.
Right.
But what I did feel
Right.
was that my shoulders would move upwards or that my knees would start to shake a little bit. And that was kind of
Mm-hmm.
my pattern that would be perhaps similar to someone else's butterflies. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to understand not only the movements in my body, but the movements in other people's bodies. So becoming a little bit more aware of body language and the impact that each movement has. And more than questioning it, I've spent a lot of time just learning and understanding and honoring each of those movements.
Mm-hmm. With openness and curiosity. Yeah. And I'm hearing you say that, as you really started to take more note of this and do all the somatic work and understand the twitch and the movements, it seems like you gained more awareness about how you operated, right? Like you had these little mini brains, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you got the cold feet and you were like, okay, this doesn't mean I'm not safe. It just means I'm uncomfortable. What sort of tools did you sort of build, or what sort of reminders did you give yourself to sort of keep you going where you needed to go rather than run, rather than, want to take off and flee?
Mm-hmm. I think the first was always encouragement that I've been in this space before. So
Okay.
I think that that's where the self confidence and self worth really played out. Was that, okay? Your toes are cold, but you know this feeling,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's okay.
So
But
you reminded yourself
yeah, I'd often tell
that, okay,
myself internally, you've got this. You're okay.
you've got this. Okay.
But then I also had techniques where I always have something in my hand, right? So I always have a little roll of yarn, or I have a pen, or I have something where when it starts to get a little bit more uncomfortable and kind of on that verge of being really uncomfortable, I have some movement that I know that when my hands are moving, particularly when my fingers are moving, that I can self regulate a bit. And so I always have that with me. So I learned little tricks like that. I learned that if I sit cross-legged, I'm able to block a little bit of the movement of the feeling of discomfort, so that helps as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think ultimately what happened is, as I started to become curious about each of my twitches or my movements, I learned how to regulate them in that moment as well. And I think that that's a really big thing, is that as parents, caregivers, practitioners, whoever you might be, educators, teachers, I think it's less about restricting those movements with the people that we work with and children, and really allowing them to lean into them and find ways to make sense of them.
Mm-hmm. Help them lean in and make sense, and
Hmm.
encourage them to go where they don't know to go, and encourage them to get curious, like, well, what would it be like?
Hmm.
What would it be like if you were to enter that space? Or what would it be like if you did an awkward move just now?
Hmm.
What would that mean? And what's the worst case? What would be the worst thing that happens if you allow your body to move in this way, right? What could you learn about yourself?
Hmm. And I think part of that is also injuries. So,
Yes, injuries are definitely a consequence or outcomes. Yeah.
but I think we learn so much when all of a sudden you've broken your baby toe and you realize how important that is for standing and walking,
Hmm.
right? And I think it's within risky play, and actually maybe that's where I'm headed, is that what really helped my developmental obstacles level out, if I can use that language, I don't know, through it was this ability to
Yeah.
engage in risky play and have supportive family to not prevent some of that risky play. Obviously there was limitations and there was barriers and boundaries put into place to make sure I wasn't going to severely injure myself,
Hmm.
but it was okay to go onto the ice and fall and
Right.
hurt yourself a little bit, and you had equipment to protect you. It was okay to play on the swing set in the back park, and try and get as high as you can, knowing that your body is
Hmm.
might get a little bit hurt, but at the end of the day you'll get up again,
Right.
right? Or so I think those were parts of that journey that really really mattered and impacted again that confidence to use my body in a way that was meaningful and productive.
Yeah, I'm really hearing a lot about the taking risk, right? So taking risk to do it differently and engaging in those riskier moments of play and knowing that your family is there to encourage you. Would you say that that has been a big part of your healing signature?
Absolutely. I think
Yeah.
it was the recognition of my parents that this is how my body, how my mind, how my soul, how I connected spiritually.
Hmm.
I think that that was huge. I think the fact that I got to witness my parents be so supportive of a sport that they had never heard of, that they didn't understand,
Hmm.
coming from East Africa to play an ice sport was kind of a weird concept, and yet my mom was
Right.
constantly on the bench with us, and she
Hmm.
organized all of our tournaments for my first 2 years of ringette. And my dad was constantly trying to take me to sports stores to learn about the new equipment and to, I remember that. I remember my parents waking up at the wee hours of the morning to get us to the ice, not just myself, but they'd pick up either teammates or we had a junior coach, picked up her along the way, and I think that that was so pivotal in the journey, was that my parents entered that unknown space with me with a lot of gratitude for that journey being a positive one for me, even though they didn't understand it.
Right. And they allowed you space for it and showed up and and kind of through actions said, well, we'll learn about it together. Right. And your mom felt
Yeah.
perhaps that, well, this is how I can get involved is being able to organize this and making sure she gets to her practices and including her teammates in the process if that's going to help. And your father saying, well, let me get her acclimatized to all the different equipment and what's changing. And maybe she'll see if there's something else that she likes or doesn't like or gets curious about. So really allowed for a space for you to sort of get curious.
And they continue
Yeah.
to do that. They continued to do that when I went into
Hmm.
university, and all of a sudden, their young daughter says, "I want to join recreation and leisure studies." Not one of those common fields that I think that many parents hope their children will enter, and without even question, they were like, "If that's what brings you joy and brings you a passion for the work you do, then by all means, we're 100% behind you." And I think there that without that I wouldn't be where I am today.
That's such a lovely reflection that you've been able to share with regards to not just how your parents have journeyed with you when you were younger, navigating through all of the unknowns and the obstacles and challenges, but how they show up in your world today. So that's really, really, it's a great recognition to sort of keep in the forefront of your mind.
Well, I think that comes with just one more thing. I think it comes with the fact that when we think about the somatic and we think about the movements of bodies, that this is a lifelong journey, just like our mental health journeys are. And I think that it's constantly changing. So we have to constantly be open and curious, or at least I believe this about my own self, that constantly curious and open to what each movement means. And today my toes might represent one thing, but tomorrow it might represent something else. And having that family support you and journey with you throughout that is really critical, that it doesn't just end when that self-confidence is achieved or presented as it's achieved, but that needs some support in being maintained.
Yeah, the support showing up in its continuity and consistency, right? That's huge,
Mhm.
right? It's hugely important. So, what would you say, Dr. Shaman, that you're grateful for with encountering this journey of yours, this untold story of navigating through these developmental obstacles uh, with sport being your way in? What would you say you're grateful for?
Yeah, I have a long list of what I'm grateful for. As I've mentioned, my family, my parents, and
Mm-hmm.
my brother.
Mm-hmm.
I've had some amazing educators along the journey. I've had
Mm-hmm.
educators that have been willing to switch up in class learning or in class meetings, so that it was something that was meaningful, made sense. It was something that it was accessible to me, and I think that that was really powerful. I
Mm-hmm.
think the other thing I'm grateful for is the opportunity and the continued opportunity to be engaged in sport and recreation and movement. I think that there is that has sport has led to the beauty of movement for me, and I think that that opportunity and the coaches along the way that never gave up even when things became difficult. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's where all of my gratitude lies. I'm grateful for the organizations and agencies that allow young kids to try new sport, and more so today to make sport
Mm-hmm.
accessible.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Dr. Shemin, when people come to see me in the therapy space, which is, different than this conversation, but when people do come to see me in the therapy space, if we were going to draw a parallel, individuals are typically in one of three places when they come to see me. They're getting started, right? Just trying to understand where do they even need to, maybe they need to sort through a bunch of the things and figure out where they need to like put the focus in their journey to get started. Some people are like in the thick of things. They're really smack in the middle and they are needing really immediate support, or there's some acute issues or stressors. And some people are looking back, either looking back and wanting to introspect and reflect and take their learnings so they can move forward into the next phase, or people are, looking back with working on how they can get closure and have the right takeaways in their back pocket. Where would you say you are in the journey? Would you say you're looking back in the middle or getting started?
I think I'll say that I'm in the middle, and I feel like I'll forever be in the middle. And I think one of the reasons for that is that with somatic work and understanding the body, it changes as we develop and we mature in different ways, and our
Mm-hmm.
bodies have different messages. There's a biological change that takes place that might affect
Mm-hmm.
that. So I think that forever in the middle, because I rely on my body to really tell me where I'm comfortable, where I'm uncomfortable, where I'm safe, where I'm not safe. I think this journey will for always forever be there and for always be a part of my life.
Yeah, the somatic messaging, it does change because you're right. Our bodies change, our bodies operate differently, our bodies have different functioning capacities, and that changes over time, or it's impacted as a result of something else, right? You talked about physical injuries not too long ago, and I could say bring up the concept of physical injury versus emotional injury, right? And how we have to protect a certain element of ourselves when it's not when it needs more attention. And so that means we're going to operate differently in another way. So, from a somatic perspective, I can see where you're coming from in terms of saying, I'm forever in the middle. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. 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 All right. So, Dr. Shemin, going through everything that you have gone through, sharing so much detail about your physical muscle twitch and the heightened sensation examples that you've provided, um, talking so much in detail about the idea of, the sense of belonging and that desire to find a way to fit in and fit or feel like you can understand where you're placed, and not feel like there was so much resistance. I also heard you talk about shame. So I guess that's what I'm curious about, because I'm curious about if you felt comfortable to share a little bit more about how all of this impacted your mental health. And I think that's why shame keeps coming up in my mind. That gets me curious about sort of with shame or anything else, how your mental health was impacted by all this.
I think the first and foremost that comes to my mind is this idea of sense of belonging and sense of self-worth. And I think that greatly impacts the way that I show up in space. So when I feel good about myself, I show up significantly different than when I don't feel so good about myself. And so I think when all of a sudden I was caught, I guess, right? Caught in the lie that I couldn't read, but I was pretending I could. There's a degree of shame that comes with that. And then there's a degree of, well, maybe I don't belong in this space. Maybe I don't belong in the classroom. But really, I loved being in the classroom. I loved hearing my educators. I loved listening to my brother talk. And so that shame, I think, really impacts how I showed up and how I felt about belonging in certain spaces. And then when you go and you flip that, right? And I think that that's where sport really helped navigate some of this, was that, wait a second, I am capable, I am confident, I am skillful, and I just need to do it in a different way than what I've been educated or told to do. And so I think my mental health significantly improved as soon as I found an outlet that made sense and that someone was able to interpret. And I think that became a big part of my journey, was finding ways to articulate how I was feeling, how I understood things, how I was interpreting things, how I was being a part of community in ways that others could understand. And there was like that clarity in, okay, when I hit my stick hard on the ice, I'm mad, I'm upset about either a play I just did or a call that the ref made or whatever that might be. But then also when I would take the back end of my stick and run behind my net, because I was a goalie, and I would bang it on the side, that was me cheering for my team because I was not part of that goal up ahead directly, and I didn't get to pat them on their backs, right? So there was an articulation that came with that. And when I was able to say, okay, people understand me and I don't need to use words, my mental health improved. And that's really where I focus a lot of my work and energy, is that words are really powerful and really important, but there are other ways to articulate, through art, through, like, you introduced in the bio, like the weaving and stuff. Those are articulations of an expression.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's storytelling that comes through all kinds of form, right? Through dance, through different arts, in so many different expressions. And there's also a lot of experiential ways of therapy, right? So not everyone is going to have the words or the articulation to express what they need to express. And especially as a young child growing up, we don't always have the words. We don't always have the expression to, just because we're experiencing something or feeling something, it doesn't mean that we know how to get it out. So when you're able to find your outlet, it's so important to like hone in on it. And it seems like this is something you were able to do. So I'm so grateful to hear that this happened for you and that you were able to like find that it, to help you get through and then to help you navigate and make sense as you continue your life's journey through the somatic and all of this navigation and through sport. It's really incredible that you've been able to tap into it and that you're able to articulate it so well now. Like I'm just, picturing this story in my mind. I'm just thinking about where you might have been at that time and what that was like for you to not have the words. And for me to sit here now, listening to all of your words and how they all make sense. And you're expressing it with such detail and emotion and describing and expressing what that process was like for you when you didn't have the words. So to me, that's very inspirational.
Yeah, I think the other way that it's affected my mental health is that it led me to a spirituality that made sense. And so for me, I really believe spirituality is the connection to self, other, and other than human, however one defines that. And I think ultimately movement is that connection to self and other. And so for me, really the tagline would be is that movement is beautiful, it's powerful, and it is a way for articulation that oftentimes gets misinterpreted.
It's beautiful, it's powerful, and it can get it can get misinterpreted, right? Wow.
And there's a beauty in that misinterpretation, because I could be articulating myself in one way and use my body movements in a particular way that then another can read whatever they want to read, but I've been able to say what I needed to say through that movement.
Right. Yeah, and each person's movement could have a different interpretation. It could mean something different, right? So when someone tells me they have a power pose, and I'm like, okay, show me, it might look very different from someone else's version of a power pose, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And compare, not comparing the two, but to a third person, they may look at the power pose and go, oh, that's my such and such pose, that's my like my relief pose, or that's my like liberating pose. That's not so much a power pose, it's this or that. So it is subjective, but it really has to make sense to each person, right? And so with you connecting your movement to what's beautiful and powerful for you and your interpretation, that's the thing that counts the most, right? So, what would you say is your key message, or what are your key messages to the listeners of our show?
I would say is spend a little bit of time understanding your movements. I think if you can start there, then a lot of beauty will flow from it. I also think if you're a parent or a caregiver, practitioner of some sort, I think really spending a little bit of time recognizing the movements in those that you spend the most time with, and understanding them from a sense that it's saying something, but you don't necessarily need to know exactly what it's saying. So leaving that curiosity to understand not only your own movements, but the movements of those around you, would be my biggest message, and to let the power flow through those movements. I also think
Mm-hmm.
where and if possible offer opportunities for children and young people to experience different recreational, leisure, sporting activities that allows them to find different ways to express themselves. Having multiple ways to express oneself is so important, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that providing opportunity and space for that becomes really critical.
Mm-hmm. It is. And it's so great the way you've been able to say it. And yes, multiple ways, introducing multiple ways to people for sure. That way one can cultivate what's good for them, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about what would you say is your that game changer inspo that's really close to you that would reflect your untold story. So is there like a quote, an event, a book, something that speaks to you that was really game changing for you?
I think that moment with my brother was a game changer. And the second moment that was a huge game changer was in grade 11 when my classmates were reading Shakespeare, and my English teacher pulled me aside and said, "You know, Shemine, I think Ishmael by Daniel Quinn would be a more interesting read for you." And being given that opportunity to read something different, something that really led me down this journey of understanding my body and my movement and what I define as spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
changed the way I interpret and see the world. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
that was the second pivotal moment in my life. And I've had many, but those two would be the primary ones.
Yes, those are pivotal for you, right? And so, what is a cause or organization that's been impactful to you in your journey that you want to give a shout out to?
Mhm. Oh gosh, so many. Sport is my cause, and I think
Yes.
that is universal. So every community has a degree of sport, but I would say very closely right now in this moment, there's an agency here in Edmonton, Alberta called Free Play for Kids, and they offer opportunities to children with very minimal barriers to access programming, and I have no words to explain how much that excites me, because kids are getting the opportunity to express themselves. And so I would say that
Mm-hmm.
that's a cause or an agency that I really stand behind.
That's awesome. So you said it's free play for kids?
Yes, yeah.
So freeplayforkids.com?
Yeah, I believe it's .com,
Okay,
yeah.
excellent. Okay, and so if people want to connect with you, if they'd like to, how are you findable?
Oh, I'm on social media a fair bit. I have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, everything under Shemine Gulamhusein. Even if you just Google, a couple of websites will pop up. Some articles I've written will pop up. So yeah,
Mhm.
pretty accessible, and feel free to reach out at any time.
All right. So reaching out to Dr. Shemine Gulamhusein. We'll put all of this in the show notes, so the information will be available to our guests. Not guests, our listeners. The listeners will have access to all of these details of how to connect with you in case they're not able to write it down.
Awesome.
So, Dr. Shemine, guess what?
Oh,
You just dared yourself to share. Congratulations.
oh, thank you. Thank you.
How
It's been an honor.
Yeah, what is this experience like for you? Like coming into this and where you are now, what was it like?
Mhm. It's very different because I had to it's virtual, it's audio, so I really had to rely on words more than the somatic, and so a
Mm-hmm.
very different experience, but exciting
Yes.
because I think that this is um such a powerful thing that we don't share enough about. And so I have so much respect and honor that you've created this podcast and created different ways for people to share their narratives and to highlight the strength of mental health. And I think, yeah, so I'm grateful to have been here.
Thank you for all of that lovely feedback. And I'm also very thankful for your willingness to dare and share. And let me just say that this was a very candid conversation. And hearing about the vulnerability in your story through the somatic sharing and how you learned to understand and regulate your own cues. Thank you for sharing with such articulation. And like I said, that willingness that you showed up with, and just to be here, to be with me. And yet, thank you for daring yourself to share.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Once again, Dr. Shemine, thank you for being a part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma. To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.